What is the worst wedding drama you've witnessed? I used to bartend events at a hotel, and weddings were our bread and butter. The worst wedding disaster I ever saw was unforgettable. My coworkers and I loved people watching at these events, so we usually picked up on weird vibes pretty quickly. The first red flag appeared when one of the bridesmaids sat on the groom's lap at the head table for an uncomfortably long time. Then came speech time, and we discovered this bridesmaid wasn't just anyone. She was the maid of honor. Her entire 10-minute speech was all about the groom being her best friend since childhood and their special connection that couldn't be broken. Not a single word about the bride. It was painfully awkward, but the evening carried on. The bride and groom had their first dance, though they'd barely interacted all night. Then came the money dance. The maid of honor practically pushed the other women aside to dance with the groom and started grinding against him in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. To top it off, she reached down the front of his pants with both hands in front of the entire wedding. We were stunned, but the bride seemed completely unaware, and the evening continued. As the night wound down, it was time for the couple's grand departure to their suite. But there was one problem. No one could find the groom. The bridesmaids began asking the staff if we'd seen him. A bellboy mentioned he thought the groom had gone upstairs. At the bride's request, the hotel's manager went to check the suite. The bride didn't want her bridesmaids wandering off and missing the farewell. After some knocking, guess who opened the door, looking very disheveled? That's right, the maid of honor. A moment later, the groom appeared behind her. My manager, trying to remain professional, informed the groom that his bride was looking for him and that he needed to come downstairs. It took them another 20 minutes to return to the wedding, and I kid you not, they walked back into the room together, arm in arm, as if it were perfectly normal for the groom and the maid of honor to disappear into the honeymoon suite during the reception. Even now, almost 10 years later, the memory makes me cringe. My advice to avoid such disasters: don't invite someone infatuated with your future spouse to be in your wedding party. Or better yet, don't marry someone who'd betray you right in front of your family and friends. At my cousin's wedding, one of the guests had an unfortunate, and very memorable, mishap. He had a small glass liquor bottle in his back pocket and sat down on the metal railing of a camper van he'd arrived in. The bottle shattered, leaving shards of glass embedded in his bum. Here's where it gets even more awkward. My cousin, the bride, happens to be a nurse. Whether her nurse friends were too inebriated or simply not in attendance, we're not super close, so I'm not sure. She ended up being the one to remove the glass shards from a stranger's bum. The lesson here? Be mindful about open bars and guests who might overdo it. Have someone responsible for managing intoxicated attendees, whether it's sending them home or ensuring they don't bring glass bottles in their pockets. Also, designate a sober or semi-sober person to handle any emergencies, because you never know what kind of surprises might come up. On the day of our wedding, it was discovered that the venue had booked 2 outdoor weddings at the same time. Ours and another in a gazebo not far from ours. Somehow, the father of the bride in the other wedding found out that our processions were scheduled for the same time. He also learned that our procession included a bagpiper, as my groomsmen and I were all in kilts, while his daughter's wedding procession featured a harpist. He approached me and very kindly asked if we would consider delaying our procession by about 20 minutes, so our bagpiper wouldn't drown out their harpist. After discussing it with my soon-to-be wife, we agreed that a 20-minute delay was no big deal for us. Unfortunately, the father of the bride hadn't taken some other factors into account and should have delayed his daughter's wedding instead. Their procession went off without a hitch, and everyone in their party enjoyed the harpist's beautiful music. However, when it came time for their vows, they were almost completely inaudible because our bagpiper started playing at the agreed-upon 20 minutes later. I found this out later that day, as one of my cousins attending our wedding had a friend attending the other wedding. Apparently, it was something like, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to cue bagpipes until our procession was finished." I hope the other wedding party was able to get some kind of compensation from the venue for this oversight, especially since the venue had been informed of the musicians at each wedding and didn't bother notifying either party about the potential conflict. As if that wasn't enough, our DJ burned a CD with our chosen husband and wife dance song, but didn't check it before the reception. The song wouldn't play because the CD somehow didn't burn correctly, and we had to choose another song to dance to on the fly. At least we got a nice discount from the DJ company for that one. It was my brother's 3rd wedding, Everyone shows up except the bride's father, who arrives almost an hour late in a t-shirt and jeans. He proceeds to loudly exclaim what he would do to the bridesmaids, insults the groomsmen for dressing up, gets drunk, and wrecks on the way out. I was at a friend's wedding reception, and we were having a good time dancing. A different friend's kid, who was maybe 5 or 6 years old, was hiding under a table while his parents were partying and ignoring him. The kid suddenly starts running and laughing through the dance floor, and I see him wipe something that looks like chocolate on the bride's dress. She's mortified, and the music stops as everyone looks on in shock. It wasn't chocolate, it was poo. He had pooed into his hand and wiped it on people. The groomsmen told the parents they needed to leave, and they did. I found out later that the kid had done this before at home. Seriously, what? The bride, to her credit, didn't let it ruin the night. She swapped into a different dress, and within 30 minutes, she was back on the dance floor, rocking out and keeping the party alive. I was so impressed by how she managed to roll with it. We all partied into the early morning, so despite the chaos, everything worked out in the end. Years later, when it was my turn to get married, I decided to have a child-free wedding. My story is more funny than horror. I was one of 9 groomsmen in my friend's wedding. During the ceremony, we were all lined up on stage, but the last groomsman in the line, the bride's brother, was standing a good 30 feet away from where the bride and groom were. Before we walked out, the bride's brother leaned over to me and said, "Man, I gotta fart so badly." Thinking he was joking, I casually replied, "Let her rip." About 10 minutes into the 45-minute ceremony, he actually did let it rip, but silently. Thanks to the church's air conditioning, it took a little while for the stench to reach me. When it did, it was like a low-hanging fog. Over the next few minutes, I watched as this invisible cloud of odor overtook each groomsman, one by one, with their expressions changing in real time. It eventually reached the groom, who wrinkled his nose, then the priest, who paused mid-sentence, and finally the bride, who started gagging. Cousin April's wedding in 1992 was nothing short of a spectacle. The groom had apparently slept with a stripper at his bachelor party the night before. And yet, there they were, ready to tie the knot at a wedding chapel, proudly boasting that John Wayne Bobbitt, yes, that John Wayne Bobbitt, was working there. The real chaos began after the ceremony. The bride and groom partied hard from the moment they got into their limo, drinking and celebrating on their way to the reception. Once there, they kept sneaking off to the bathrooms to continue the festivities, while the rest of the family followed suit in their own way. Relatives of all ages got thoroughly wasted, including my husband's grandparents. My husband and I were the only sober ones in the room. The music choices were interesting, to say the least. At one point, Cousin Lori decided she wanted to slow dance with my husband to 9 Inch Nails' "I Want to F You Like an Animal." Did I mention Lori and my husband are first cousins? Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. As the night wore on, the kids at the reception, unsupervised and hyped up on sugar, smeared wedding cake and food all over each other, turning the dance floor into a sticky mess. Meanwhile, one enterprising relative made off with all the table decorations, apparently deciding they were party favors. By the end of the evening, the bride and groom returned to her mother's house with the rest of the family. Their main priority? Opening envelopes to see how much cash they'd received. Everything else, gifts, the reception, even their guests, seemed like an afterthought. Amazingly, the marriage lasted 10 years. It finally ended when Cousin April got tired of her husband's late-night absences, explained away by, "I was too tired to drive home." Oh, and in case you're wondering, Cousin April is an elementary school teacher. At a wedding I attended, the best man started his speech with what seemed like a harmless and familiar opening. "I've seen the groom with a lot of girls over the years." It's the kind of setup you expect to lead into something sweet, like, "But you're the best thing that ever happened to him," or something along those lines. Except, that's not what happened. As the speech continued, it became painfully clear that the best man was unintentionally outing the groom as a serial cheater. He wasn't aware that the bride and groom had been dating long before he even became friends with the groom. To the bride, this wasn't reminiscing about a wild past. It was a confession of infidelity. The bride was livid. The mood in the room shifted dramatically, and the tension was palpable. Needless to say, the rest of the evening was awkward for everyone involved. At my sister's wedding, the groom decided to get a little dramatic as they prepared to walk back up the aisle. He went for a dip kiss, one of those romantic movie moments. Except it didn't go quite as planned. Instead of sweeping her off her feet, he dropped her straight onto the floor. The entire room let out a collective gasp, which was quickly followed by uncontrollable laughter as the shock wore off. It was easily one of the most awkward things I've ever witnessed in real life, but also one of the funniest. Thankfully, my sister was a good sport about it, and as her sibling, I now have the priceless gift of being able to remind her of this moment for the rest of our lives. Even better, there's photo evidence to back me up. It was a medium-sized wedding, no more than 75 people, including the bridal party and groomsmen. The bride's sister-in-law, however, was absolutely furious about something. The wedding took place by a lake, and everyone knew the venue, so we all dressed casually. Shirts and comfortable trousers, sundresses and sandals. But not the sister-in-law. She was dressed like she was heading out for a night of dinner and dancing. Sky-high heels, a tight dress, rhinestones everywhere. She looked stunning, but definitely not comfortable, especially since we were outside. The ceremony itself was lovely, except for the constant muttering picked up by the small microphone up front. Freaking bugs, pine needles, dirt. After the ceremony, we all walked over to the gazebo picnic area where the reception was being held, and that's when the sister-in-law lost it. She started throwing her high heels at her husband, screaming about how terrible the day was, and in the process managed to cut open his eyebrow. As people scrambled to help him, getting napkins for the bleeding, because facial wounds bleed like crazy, and trying to rush him to the car to get him to the hospital, the sister-in-law decided to escalate things. She dramatically shouted, "I can't take this anymore," and proceeded to launch herself off the dock in a wild, over-the-top dive. The only problem? The lake was only about 4 feet deep, and marshy, so instead of a dramatic plunge, she just kind of bobbed around in the water. Everyone was still focused on her husband's injury, but her dad, without missing a beat, just turned to the lake, told her to get out, and to stop with the nonsense. In the end, they piled into 2 cars and drove off. The whole thing was surreal, to say the least. It all started on the morning of the wedding. Everyone was in high spirits getting ready at the hotel, but things started to get weird when the groom, let's call him Tom, was nowhere to be found. The wedding was supposed to be at 4 p.m., and it was already 1 p.m., and no one had heard from him since the night before. At first, we figured he was just nervous or needed some space, so we didn't think too much of it. But by 3 p.m., when he still hadn't shown up to get ready, we started to panic. The bride, Emma, was getting frantic. She was in the middle of her hair and makeup, but I could tell she was getting worried. She kept checking her phone, making excuses, but it was clear something wasn't right. Then, we found out where Tom had been. One of the groomsmen, Matt, got a call from Tom's brother. Turns out Tom had gone out the night before with a couple of his friends to celebrate before the wedding, and let's just say things got out of hand. He ended up at a bar, drinking, and, long story short, found himself at a hotel with some woman who, according to Matt, didn't know he was about to get married. So, not only had Tom completely ghosted his wedding day preparations, but he had also been caught in the act with another woman. Meanwhile, the wedding guests were starting to arrive at the venue, and Emma was still in the dark, completely unaware that Tom wasn't even in the building. To make matters worse, a few of the bridesmaids were in on it. One of Emma's best friends had actually seen the whole thing go down at the hotel, and instead of telling her right away, she'd been keeping it quiet. She didn't want to ruin the day. What a disaster. Eventually, Tom showed up around 4:30 p.m., still wearing the same clothes from the night before, looking like he'd been hit by a bus. The wedding was supposed to start at 4 p.m., but thanks to his last-minute arrival, we were delayed for over an hour. Emma was furious. She pulled him aside, and they had a heated argument in the back of the venue while the guests waited in the lobby. Now, I don't know what was said during that conversation, but when Emma came back out, she was visibly upset, but she still walked down the aisle. The ceremony went on. Tom seemed completely checked out, and Emma barely smiled. But here's the kicker. The reception went on like nothing happened. Emma still wore her wedding ring. Tom did too, and they danced together like everything was fine. People were whispering, but they acted like nothing was wrong. It was honestly surreal. A few months later, they ended up getting divorced, and Emma was left picking up the pieces. Tom, of course, tried to apologize, but after everything that went down, no one was surprised. Okay, I think we've had enough drama for today. Thank you for joining me, and don't forget to subscribe.